Good evening. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece. Tonight, I am pleased and honored to have a guest who really doesn't need any introduction, the world-renowned musical artist Roger Waters. Roger is not only an extraordinary and accomplished musician, he's also a passionate and outspoken defender of peace and human rights, which are the very subject that I want to talk to Roger about tonight. But before we go there, Roger, I want to tell my audience that I just discovered that you speak Greek better than most Greek Canadians that I know, which is really quite a revelation. I've known you all these years. I had no idea. That's something, a connection between us that I never knew even existed. But in any event, brother, I'm very pleased to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me tonight.
Yeah, go. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Parakalo. So, Roger, I want to start by talking about a statement that you put out on X on September 13th. And in it, you warned about the imminent threat of nuclear war, and you repeated the phrase, "Niet means niet." I knew exactly what you were referring to, but many others might not. Could you elaborate for us what prompted you to put out that statement? Why did you employ that phrase?
I think I put it out because it was the first inklings of the introduction of intermediate range missiles into the fray with the permission of the United States and the UK government, Storm Shadow, ATACMS, or whatever they are. So, so we were faced with Blinken and Biden and Jake Sullivan and whatever saying, yeah, we're going to give permission for the Nazis in Ukraine to start firing medium-range or long-range missiles into the heartland of Russia. Now, this is, and I was reminded that William J. Burns, I think it is he the director of the CIA now? Anyway.
He is, yes.
In 2008, I think it was, he is the one that passed on the message, Vladimir Putin, saying, "Niet means niet," where no means no. Well, this is the message that Gorbachev passed across to the Western hegemony, the American empire, roughly saying, okay, we're going to end the Warsaw Pact, we're going to blah, 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 we're going to withdraw to the borders of the Russian Federation. But we will only do so without any conversation, apart from this one. You do not advance NATO beyond the eastern border of a unified Germany, because we're going to agree to the unification of Germany and all of that and withdraw. James Baker, it was, who was the, I think, Secretary of State at the time, went, absolutely agree, not a problem. We agree. And it was all very public and oh, what a bright new future. And from then, that was in 1989 or 1990. Funnily enough, the following year, I went to Berlin and performed the wall, put on a performance of the wall in the Potsdamer Platz, which had been empty since 1961, since the building of the Berlin. Anyway, that's another story. But it was an act of celebration of détente, perestroika. So the Americans and the rest of NATO, so aided by the poodles in Europe, chiefly the Brits and the Germans, have reneged on that agreement and that promise. And they have, as fast as they could, the neocons who control the American government have pushed armaments and NATO closer and closer and closer and closer over the years, with more and more and more Eastern European countries joining NATO for whatever reasons, none of my business, what they, to the Russian border. And all along the way, the Russians would, well, hold on just a minute, and particularly Vladimir Putin, since he's been president, which is some time now. And he made that famous speech in 2007 in Munich to gathered leaders, where he said, you can't keep doing this. And he specifically spoke about the Ukraine and made the point that any attempt to get Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an absolute red line. And the answer is niet. William Burns, when they started making noises about exactly doing that, sent a text or an email or something back to Washington saying, do you not understand Russian? Well, if you don't, here's the translation. Niet means niet, no means no. Putin is not kidding about this. This is an absolute last warning, if you like. Do not try and advance NATO into Ukraine. And of course, Victoria Nuland just tore it all up, threw it away, and they poured billions into the Maidan coup. And John McCain went over there warmongering and raising his fist in support of the Nazis who were about to destroy democracy in the Ukraine. And they did, with a lot of help from the United States. The far right in Ukraine destroyed democracy. They got rid of the elected government and installed their own government. And it's been like that ever since. Well, for the next 6, 7, 8 years, the Russians watched the civil war start and develop. They watched the encroachment and then the attacks on the people of the Donbass in the oblasts, Lugansk and Donetsk specifically. They watched them being bombed, being attacked, being murdered by the government in Kiev. And eventually, and they kept coming back, and they eventually tried to make a deal. It was called the Minsk Accords, right? In 2020 or 21 or whatever. It was a platform upon which Vladimir Zelensky had stood in his campaign to become the president, as the second president of the new regime, which he did. It was based absolutely, and he got a huge mandate from all the people of Ukraine. All the people of Ukraine voted for him for president. Well, 75%. That's a big majority in any country. And it was democratic, and he was elected. But he was elected on the platform that he was going to implement the Minsk Accords. What were they? That Lugansk and Donetsk were going to become semi-autonomous, so that they would retreat somewhat from this unified entity that was Ukraine. And why? Because they were being slaughtered by the Ukrainian government. And so they went, no. They're Russian speaking. Of course, speaking Russian now in Zelensky's Ukraine is illegal. As are all opposition parties.
Right.
There's not even the faintest pretense that the current government of Ukraine has anything to do with democracy or freedom or all the things that we're supposed to be fighting for. In the rules-based order. I know I'm rambling.
No, not at all. I think it was vitally important that you say these things. Zelensky, I just want to add a couple of points, which I'm sure you're aware of. Zelensky's mandate has expired. Nonetheless, remains in office under martial law. The memo, the William Burns memo, people need to understand, I think, if they don't already know, that the reason why we know about that memo is because of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Otherwise, this incredibly important piece of historical evidence. One of the many ways in which Julian Assange contributed to our understanding of the realities of this world. Roger, I want to pose a question to you, which may sound silly, but it has to be asked, because right now in the West, and particularly in Canada, where I spend half my time, there is this really persecution of people who ascribe to the views that you and I ascribe to with respect to the Ukraine war. And we are accused constantly of being apologists for Russia, Kremlin shills, and so forth. And it seems like if you say anything which more or less accords with the position taken by the Russian government, you are assumed either to be under the influence of Russian disinformation or to have some ulterior motive. Like, for example, they're paying you to say these things, which obviously ain't the case with you and me. So I'm just curious, and this is my question, again, which may sound silly. How did you come to have these views? What formed the basis of your understanding of the role of NATO in all of this, that there was a coup in Ukraine, that there were violations of a Minsk Accord. Was it because you are under the undue influence of Russian disinformation, Roger? How do you respond to the claim that, because in fact, someone on your tweet responded immediately, which won't surprise you, by saying, why are you such a Russian apologist when you tweeted net means net? I think people might be interested to know how you came to this understanding.
All right. Okay, here's a very short answer, but because I believe in love and truth. So I love Julian Assange because he told us the truth. Because the words of things like the William Burns memo are allowed to speak for themselves. In the world that Julian Assange was subscribed to, we the people, and particularly in any society or country that even pretends to believe in democracy or freedom or any of that stuff, Julian Assange is an absolutely central part to the puzzle, okay? Because we know that our rulers are corrupt and that they to some extent or other. It's the nature, even in a so-called liberal democracy, that the things that drive the people who arrive at the top and lead these countries are driven by wealth and power to go to all those meetings. Can you imagine? And to have to learn to lie to all those people all the time, and to learn to manipulate the mainstream media and so on and so forth, so that you can garner enough of a block of opinion to support you, like the guy who would call me a Russian shill for repeating the memo that Julian Assange published, yet means yet, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one thing. Okay. So I believe in truth and love, and truth and love sit squarely upon my platform, which is December the 10th, Paris, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay. So 30 articles. I'm not going to read them. Everybody watching this program must go and read those 30 articles. Because if those 30 articles from that declaration at the end of that Second World War that we had back then were applied through a United Nations representing the peoples of the United Nations of this earth, if they were applied as international law by the ICC and by the ICJ, for instance, that would be the end of tyranny. That would be the end of war. Julian Assange was trying to tell us that by simply giving us the information upon which to make judgments. Now, that's one thing, okay? The other thing's my mother. Tell this story. My mother saw me wondering about something when I was a little kid, 13 maybe, early teenage. God knows what I was worrying about. It was something. And she looked at me and she thought, that kid's thinking about something. So she went, come here, sit down. I've got something to say to you. Yes, Mum, what is it? She said, when you're thinking about something, I don't want to know what it is, but I want to tell you something true. Whenever you will be faced with things that you have to ponder and think about all through your life, because there are knotty problems and they're going to come up. And if you want to be part of all of this, you're going to have to think things through. When that happens, I don't want to know what it is. She said, when that happens, read everything you can get your hands on. Read, read, read. And don't just read the opinions of people who agree with you. Read everything. Back to Assange. This was Assange's life's work, was beginning that process so that the information to read is available to that little Roger and who he was going to grow up to become and whatever. If they suppress Julian Assange and me and you, whatever, there's nothing to read. But if it's there, read, read, read. Okay, Mum, when you've read everything, read some more. That's it. You've done everything you need, all the heavy lifting. But then what do I do, Mum? And she said, oh, The last bit's easy. You do the right thing. So suddenly, age 13, I'm handed that piece of golden advice, but also the idea that there is a moral compass and that it's real. So that is my belief systems are all based on the idea that there is right and wrong. Sometimes it's a bit fudgy, but it exists. So for instance, if we're looking at the politics today, the genocide that the Israeli government are committing in Palestine and have been for at least the last 75 and probably the last 100 years is wrong. Very, very wrong. And the right thing in the whole of the Middle East, but certainly in Palestine, Israel, is equal human rights for everyone in a democratic state. There'll have to be a new democratic state, but that is the right thing to happen. So, so the Syria campaign can say, shut him up, he's an Assad apologist. So they can say whatever they want. The truth is the truth. Niet means niet. And the only thing that's important in our lives is love of our brothers and sisters.
And precisely what I want to talk to you about in context of the Palestinian cause. Before I do that, I just want to say that I recently saw you explain to Piers Morgan the importance that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights plays in your life. And I'm laughing because he immediately responded by telling you that he purportedly embraces the Universal Declaration as passionately as you do. I almost fell off my chair, Roger, when I saw that, because the man has been acting effectively as a shill for Israel's genocidal regime for much, if not all of his career. But let's talk about the Palestinian people for a moment. And I must tell you, I know that this is a cause that means a great deal to you. You've been extraordinary in your support of the Palestinian cause. It's something that means a great deal to me. And I have to tell you that before this rampage began in Gaza in October of last year, I was actually feeling, I'd never said this to anybody, I didn't want to discourage people in the movement, but I was feeling pessimistic about the future of the Palestinian people. And oddly, strangely, after watching with horror what has been done to them over the past 11 months, seeing their steadfastness, their dignity, the incapacity of this monstrous regime to defeat them and to subjugate them, I actually feel, despite waking up every day and oftentimes being brought to tears by what I see being done to them, more hopeful than I've ever felt for the Palestinian people. I feel like the Zionist entity is digging its own grave. Of course, the Palestinian people have a great deal to do with that. So too do other resistance groups in the region. And I wonder, Roger, how are you feeling at this stage about the future of the Palestinian people and their decades-long struggle for freedom and dignity?
Well, it's interesting that you put it like that, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because I haven't thought about it quite like that. But if I do look into my heart, I think I can see what you're saying. Because I think what you're saying is that Israel, the Zionist entity, nothing to do with Jews, by the way, or the Jewish religion or Jewish people. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about this monstrosity of a regime in Israel. The Americans have supported them, no questions asked at all through the past 75 years. So, but it may be that what the Americans have done is give them rope. And it may be that you may be right. It may be that they've taken the rope and hung themselves. Because I think in the court of public opinion, with the billions of people who live on this beleaguered planet, we, the people, have seen what they've done, and we are disgusted by it. And almost to a man, we are against it. Of course, there's AIPAC and ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, these people from the Syria campaign, all of them fighting desperately to suppress the truth of what's happening and to go on supporting it. But the fact that they're going on supporting the genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, in the whole of occupied Palestine, shows them for who they are. Genocide Joe and Kamala Harris and all the rest of them, all of them. AOC, yeah, you AOC, all of them.
100%.
Well, not Jill Stein, obviously, or Dr. West, or what. There are one or two politicians in there, but who have no hope of ever getting it. Not to mention Jill Stein's running mate. What's his name? I keep forgetting his name, but he's
Bruce Ware.
Bruce Ware. I've watched him on the couple of tiny moments where they're allowed to express opinion. This is a really very special man, in my view. And Jill Stein is.
Yeah, inspirational. He's inspirational. I didn't know about Bruce Ware until he became.
Neither did I. He came as a complete shock and surprise to me.
Mm-hmm.
And he's amazing. And I think he could be a great name for the future. But before he can be a great name in the future, the monolith of the monster that is the evil American empire has to be dismantled piece by piece by we the people, and particularly by the people of the United States, who sadly they fall constantly, hook, line and sinker, for the Overton window paradigm of
right.
There are Democrats and Republicans, and they are our government, and it'll all be all right. No, it won't, because what the genocide in Palestine has shown us is they don't give an F about human rights. They never did.
Never.
They've never cared ever about anybody's human rights except their human right to keep stealing from the rest of us.
Right. I think what you said, Robert, what you just, I have to emphasize it because it is so important. The key, and I say this to people in the, because I come from the Green Party tradition, although I'm feeling estranged from the Green Party nowadays, thanks to the German Greens in particular. I say this oftentimes to people in the environmental movement. We can't solve any of the problems that confront us unless we overcome the American military monster. It really is the key to resolving everything. And unless and until we can disempower the American elite, or I should say more, it's a US-based elite, because there are members of this oligarchy who reside outside the United States but are integral parts of it, then we're never going to be able to resolve, for example, the climate emergency. We're not going to be able to have peace in this world. We're not going to have social justice in this world. We're not going to have even a modicum of respect for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as long as the United States is the world hegemon. I think that should be clear to all of us now, and that we should devote ourselves singularly to the task of freeing ourselves of that tyranny, that US oligarchic tyranny that has been haunting the world ever since the end of the Second World War. But in any event, Roger, I want to talk to you for a moment about switching gears, about free speech. And it's my impression, having watched actually an alarm over the last several months, the arrest of Richard Medhurst at Heathrow Airport, Pavel Durov being hoodwinked into being arrested by the French authorities, Sarah, I believe her name is Sarah Jackson or Jackman in England, a Palestinian. She was Wilkinson. Thank you for correcting me. And I could give many other examples. Alia Bunima at Electronic Intifada was temporarily deplatformed from YouTube. And I could go on and on. Yeah. My impression is that I've never witnessed in my lifetime so much repression of dissent as I'm seeing today. And I note in particular, Roger, that your name is on that notorious, I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, that your name is on that notorious Mitrovets kill list that was established by the Ukrainian government to identify enemies of the Ukrainian state, and that you've denounced this for obvious reasons. Is it your impression that we're living in an unparalleled era of censorship and suppression of dissent, or do you think it's more or less been like this all along?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question because the only new arrow we have in our quiver is, if it can be maintained, would be a free internet, free social media. So if we could count in the future on a social media unfettered by the arrest of whatever the Russian kid's name is, who started Telegram, and or all the rest of it that's going on. If it wasn't, I'm looking, if Meta, as it's now called, wasn't owned by a idiot like Mark Zuckerberg, who thinks he's the reincarnation of Yahweh. You know, these very, very rich people sort of think they're God, and they sort of are because they're very rich. And so I haven't, but many people have lost sight of the fact. And though whenever he appears, Zuckerberg, anyway, you can see he's a prick. He's just a wanky little prick who got lucky by deciding to grade co-eds on some horrible website that he started when he was a teenager, I believe. Oh, she's pretty. She's a 7. Oh, she's got a nice bum. Let's give her a 6. Oh, this one's gorgeous. She's a 10. You know, fuck, are you kidding me?
And now he's one of the wealthiest men on the planet.
And he's one of the wealthiest men with all this power, which he is sharing with the CIA and the FBI and the government. And so he can be part of all of that. People with huge amounts of money, oligarchs, tend to drift towards the centers of political power in order to keep all their money and keep that and exercise their power to some extent. But also, if you're Zuckerberg and Meta, to actually say, here, you're the government. I trust you. You are the American government. So you are our only hope to keep the world free. And what, are you fucking stupid, Zuckerberg? Well, yes, I am actually. You only have to watch me speaking for a minute or two to see that I'm a complete idiot. Oh, yeah, okay, cool. You know. Anyway, that me ranting on about Zuckerberg, and no, you can't use another brick to advertise Instagram, you fucking moron. Absolutely not. Because he did. He wrote to me one day, not personally, but they did. They wanted to use another brick in the wall part too as a new advertising campaign to sell Instagram.
Oh,
anyway, where am I going with this? Yeah. Can we keep our fingernails on the edge of the cliff of being allowed to read anything? That's going to be the big trick. Or will we let go of the edge of the cliff and accept Big Brother and Oceania and Eurasia and East Asia and whatever as being that 1984 becomes the absolutely acceptable reality of our lives? Because that's where we're living. Like 80% of our life is that, with quite large chunks of Huxley, Aldous Huxley thrown in, Brave New World. You know, the injecting of chemicals into the test tubes where we're growing our babies. Do you remember that bit in the Brave New World? That's the whole point, so that we can grow people who are perfectly happy, you know, riding a lift up and down. Oh, and they love it. Yeah. And I'm going to denigrate people who have jobs like that. We all have to make a living somewhere. But isn't it interesting that we're living in this? I wrote a whole fucking album about it. What, 30 years ago now? 1991, what's it? Oh, Amused to Death came out. Yeah. When they found our shadows grouped around the TV sets, something every test. The only explanation left, this species has amused itself to death. Well, yeah, it has, because they take over and then there we are. You can't watch the TV in America without knowing absolutely for sure that you are being amused to death with this crap, because behind the crap, they are committing genocide in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Right.
They, same people who are giving you this crap to take your mind off it, they're doing that. I had this terrible vision, waking vision, of this Palestinian man with 2 plastic bags full of something or other going, I'm sorry I'm late. I had to pick the kids up. I know, I feel horrible even telling you, but that sort of play on words, if you like, came into my head. But
Right.
you and I look at these images every fucking day, and we do weep. I weep every morning. I'm nearly weeping now. And I'm not going to, because the world that we're living in is so horrific, with both contenders, for instance, to become the commander-in-chief of the US behemoth, the murderous military machine that is going around the world trying to steal everything that everybody's got by military force, are entirely happy with the murdering and dismembering of babies in Gaza. They're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on them and blowing them to pieces so that the parents, if they are lucky enough to find any of the bits, have to put them in a plastic bag and then trying to figure out whether they can find anywhere to bury them. And this is going on behind our Overton window and alongside it. So, sorry, is the intensity of the genocide enough to make me feel faintly optimistic that it can't go on? Yeah, but how does it go on today and tomorrow? And it does, it's going on. It's going on. How is it going to come to an end? Is it only going to come to an end when the Zionist extremists organize Armageddon in the Middle East by pushing everybody so far that there's nothing left but Armageddon?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing in behind the behemoth that is the military might of the United States of America. There are evangelical Christians also gagging for the end of time. So that's why at all my gigs, when I sing Two Suns in the Sunset, I make a little speech always saying, wake the fuck up. Do people not understand how insanely dangerous all this is? And we have Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer and others telling us, and me and you, telling everybody this all the time. But people just sort of go, what's he talking about? Well, let's hope
it might well end in Armageddon. The way we're going, that's certainly a distinct possibility. But I think there's also another possibility, and that is the internal collapse of the Zionist entity. Would be some combination of military impotence, because despite its ability to massacre civilians, it's having a hell of a time defeating people who actually know how to fight and have the arms to do so. And also it's suffering immensely from an economic perspective. And I think that the sense of insecurity of those in Israel who want the oppression of the Palestinian people is being slowly degraded. So much so here where I am, Roger, I don't know if you've been, I think you indicated you haven't been in Greece for a couple of years. And I'm just about to do a report on this, but there has been a massive influx of Israelis in the south of Greece and to the island of Cyprus, where I have a sister and nephews and a niece. And I think that that's a harbinger of what's coming, because the population there, which is extraordinarily brainwashed and has dehumanized the Palestinian people, the Israeli Jewish population, sadly, is waking up to the reality that they can no longer dominate the region. And it is absolutely the case that the Palestinian people are likely, I hate to say this, it pains me to say it, to pay a terrible price for some time yet to come. But I just don't see how we go back to the world in which we lived prior to October 7th. I don't know how people can unsee what they've seen. I don't think Israel is on a sustainable path, and perhaps I'm being unduly optimistic, but I count myself as a realist, and I feel more strongly than ever that liberation is at hand. Not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but in my lifetime and your lifetime, I believe the Palestinian people will be free, and I believe it more than I ever did. And let us hope that I'm right about this one. Sorry, go ahead.
Let us hope so. Let us hope so. Because you're right. There are very few possible outcomes to this, and one of them is the outcome that you and I hope for, which is and the outcome is that we adopt Paris 1948, human rights are important, and we impose them. We say, no, we, the peoples of this United Nations, insist upon equal human rights for us,
right?
All of us.
And we will withhold our cooperation in every possible way until you respect those rights.
Yeah, but Dimitri, what you're saying as well is that BDS has got getting a really tight grip on the throat of the Zionist entity now, because they're leaving in droves.
100%.
You're telling me that the Israeli population is leaving Israel because, and I'm not suggesting that they're all rats, of course they're not, but they are leaving a sinking ship, is what I think what you're saying. And I do so hope you're right about that. And I'm very sorry that it happened. I apologize for the UK government and for William Balfour in 1917 and the letter he wrote to Lord Rothschild, blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry it happened. My father was teaching English at St. George's School in Jerusalem in 1934 and 1935, and he wrote letters home to my grandmother saying how worried he was about potential outcomes for the indigenous people of Palestine, who he could see in 1934 what was going on. Mm-hmm. And he could see what was likely to happen which is pretty amazing. Obviously, he was killed a few years later in the war, but
you're foreseeing yet again my next question, Roger. I wanted to talk to you about the British government. So earlier in our discussion, you referred to European leaders as poodles. So I have another word. It's actually one that I've borrowed from the left-wing German politician Sarah Wagenknecht, who recently on mainstream television referred to Olaf Scholz as a vassal. They're vassal. So Starmer has now been in office for a little more than 2 months. You know, we still see references to Starmer in the corporate media in the West as a leftist and a progressive. What is your take, Roger, on Keir Starmer and his new government?
Well, if he's a leftist, I'm a fascist. I ain't, and he ain't either. Keir Starmer is just a liar. He's a lying poodle. That's it. That's all. Like Boris Johnson was. They're poodles. They are men of no stature at all. They're a bit like Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States. It can only happen because they're useful idiots. They're poodles, but they're useful to the real power, which is the oligarchs. The very rich ruling class run everything in the West. So they really are, and it is they who are responsible, for instance, for the possible impending Armageddon in Ukraine and Russia. This idea that we can have a war with Russia, which is crazy. You said you were a realist just now. That's the only thing I've got against John Mearsheimer, who I watch all the time, and I've read all his books and blah, 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 blah. But I saw him on a panel the other day where he and Jeffrey Sachs were at odds. And Mearsheimer likes to say, it is important to whatever. Yeah. So then he says, well, I'm a realist. Well, and I see Sachs kind of shaking his head, not because he said that, but because he's saying, we have to stand in opposition and make it really obvious in the South China Sea with China that there's an inevitability about the idea of superpowers confronting one another. And the only way we stay safe is by the confrontation being a real one that will, well, John, you've made a lot of sense in the past, particularly in your book about the Israeli lobby with Stephen Walt all those years ago. But you don't make any fucking sense now. That is not the way forward. Jeffrey Sachs, who has an alternate view, has the way forward, which is that is crazy. Sachs even mentioned in that panel the fact that the Chinese have been there getting things right, getting things wrong, but with the civilization before Europe was a twinkle in Yahweh's eye, you know, and certainly for thousands of years before the United States popped up. And you know, now this is never confronted in the United States, except by one or two people who care about the underlying issues of these things. Let us not forget. Of course, the United States is supporting the genocide of the Palestinian people because every European immigrant to the United States, not everyone probably, but most of them, colluded in the genocide of the native people of North and South America, right? In the 17th century and the 18th century. So this is there always in the background of it. No wonder they're dropping 2,000-pound bombs on Palestinians. If they'd had them back in the 17th century, they'd have dropped them on the on the wigwams, on the plains, on the civilization that existed there, which, if you read about it, was proper. Yeah, there was a lot more land, and it was a simpler society, and there wasn't industry. It was pre-industrial revolution and all of that. But the peoples, particularly in Canada, by the way, the peoples thought the French were insane. I.e., this idea of being able to own stuff they thought was absurd. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know if you've read any of the literature from those colonial times, and what got written down about the opinions and the philosophical and political thinking of the people who were living there, eventually almost wiped out. Right. I mean, thank goodness there's a few of them left so that we can fight the liquid gas pipeline that, running through British Columbia. And that fight goes on all day, every day. I help them as much as I can. Right. I'm not there,
and also benefit from their wisdom, which they've preserved over the years, despite the attempt to extinguish their knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to clarify, Roger, when I said realist, I did not mean to suggest that I'm a political realist in the sense of John Mearsheimer. I'm absolutely not. I agree with everything you said. I understand his political realism to be sort of an acceptance that this is the way the world functions and it will always function this way. There's this great power competition. They will engage in ruthless behavior in order to maintain their dominance and so forth. I don't accept that at all. I was simply trying to suggest that when I make predictions about what is going to happen in the future, I don't fall back upon what I hope will happen. I try to look at the evidence and make an assessment, and then with whatever ability I may have, contribute to a better outcome, if possible, through activism and journalism and so forth. So I completely reject John Mearsheimer's view, and I think that a lot of what he says about the way international relations have to operate is just completely bonkers. But in any event, I do, however, respect his critique of the Ukraine war, and he has been outspoken in condemning the genocide in Gaza, increasingly so. So there's that. Now, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Roger, which has nothing to do with, I think it does actually indirectly have a lot to do with the things we've been discussing, but it's more of a personal question. And it may be, again, a silly question to ask, but I'm curious myself, having known you for several years, is music playing the same role in your life today as it did years ago? Do you feel that there's been I find this in myself in terms of what's happening to me in my older years. I'm now 60 years old. I'm approaching retirement age, and my priorities are shifting away from the things that preoccupied me for much of my career. For example, the law. That was the principal activity that I engaged in over the last 30 years. And I want to devote the time that remains to me, however much that may be, not to the practice of law, but to helping to enlighten my fellow human beings in any way that I can, and to enlighten myself, because there's a great deal that I don't know. Do you feel that your priorities are shifting as a human being, and that, you know, performing and creating the music, the wonderful music you've been creating over these years, is not going to play quite the same dominant role within your life in the years ahead?
No, I don't feel that. I
Interesting.
mean, I'm sort of in the middle of making a new album now.
Wow.
And I find myself turning over the ideas that are involved in the making of the new album almost every day, even if it's only for a few minutes or I log on to something. So the answer is no. I'm making a record. It's called The Bar. It's based upon a long song that I wrote and that I performed bits of when I was doing my This Is Not a Drill tour. I've been recently, Sean Evans, who I work with on all things visual, we've edited with Andy Jennison, the editor, a movie of the live performance of that show in Prague last May. Now this show that we did in Prague was in the immediate aftermath of my shows in Germany, in Berlin and in Frankfurt, that the lobby, desperately tried to get cancelled. They actually got a legal, they had a legal stab at the gig in Frankfurt. I had to go to court to defend my right to perform my music in Germany, in Frankfurt. They said, you can't, you're in the Festhalle. Do you know what the Festhalle is? Why it's important? And I went, yeah, I do. It's where they took all the Jewish people on the 9th of December 1938, Kristallnacht. They rounded 3,000 Jews up and put them in the Festhalle. And then they put them in cattle trucks and sent them to somewhere where they worked them half to death. And then they sent them the other few hundred miles to Auschwitz and killed them. I know exactly what happened in 1938. The problem is that what happened in 1938, 39, 40, 41, and all through the Second World War until the supposed liberation in 1945 has rendered the German people and the whole of the country apparently deaf, dumb, and fucking blind to the genocide of the Palestinian people. And you now have fascist police beating up anyone who goes on the street dressed like Dimitri here, with a cafe around his neck, as an act of protest of this genocide. You've made it illegal. They tried to make my shows illegal. They said I was glorifying fascism. What?
That's
So
anyway. Anybody with, you know, an ounce of common sense knows that it's exactly the opposite. I've seen your show. It is an extraordinarily eloquent denunciation of fascism, and how anybody could interpret this as a glorification of fascism is mind-boggling. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
Well, they make that story up, the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt. This is one of the arch villains. He took over from my old friend. He wasn't a friend, but Abe Foxman, who for many years in my early career was the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, by the way. I think it's wonderful that that's what it's called, and they do nothing but defame people. 24/7, they do nothing but defame me and people like me.
I know, I've been on the receiving end many times.
Isn't it wonderful that that's what they're naming? They forced BMG, who were my record company in Germany, to cut ties with me, to refuse to release my last record, which was a remake of Dark Side of the Moon. Said, no, you can't. And BMG went, yep, oh, whoops, can't remember, whatever. And the way they did it was by writing them letters, which I have since published. There's a letter from Jonathan Greenblatt. And he says, otherwise, we may be forced to make public your relationship with the Third Reich. Because the parent company, Bertelsmann's, who were publishers, published anti-Jewish pamphlets from 1938 on, all through the war. Right. And so they threatened them with that and say, if you don't do what this is the way the lobby works. It's amazing.
Right.
It's a protection racket. The ADL is an absolute protection racket working on behalf of the Israel lobby. And somehow so far it's managed to kind of get away with it. I think they're mightily miffed that they haven't managed to destroy me, and that I am a dog that bites back, and I bite back as hard as I fucking well can, as often as I can. Because these people are arseholes, and they're trying to sell this lie that, you know, Israel's a democracy and blah, 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 and all Arabs are awful and Muslims are, you know, eat children and all of this, well, this absolute nonsense that they're trying to. No, they're not.
Roger, I must say, in terms of their failure to silence you, I've always sensed that the degree of hostility you get from the lobby, not surprisingly, is directly proportional to the size of your audience. My audience is a tiny fraction of your audience, and I've had to put up with the most ridiculous smears of my character from the Israel lobby. I can't believe what you've had to endure. It's far worse than what I've had to endure, because you reach so many more people. You touch so many more hearts, and you persuade so many more minds. And I must commend you, Roger. Now, this is the last thing I want to say to you during this conversation, for which I thank you immensely, is that I admire enormously, because I know how hard it is for you to do what you do with the audience that you have. It's truly remarkable. And at the same time, I'm thrilled to hear that your commitment to music hasn't waned one iota, because it's been one of the greatest gifts that you've conferred upon your contemporaries, is your extraordinary music. And thank you so much for coming on my program, Reason to Resist. I hope we will have an opportunity to talk some more in the future. And I wish you peace and health, brother.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri. I'd just like to say one more thing, which is that you just said how hard it is for me, because I come under all this attack and blah, 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 blah. The thing that would be, I nearly said harder, not harder, impossible for me, impossible, completely impossible, is to not speak out. It's impossible for me to stand by silent and indifferent. I agree with Elie Wiesel, whatever other rubbish that man spoke. That is the greatest sin of all. So the biting back is part of the speaking out. I could not speak.
Amen. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you with Roger Waters from Kalamata, Greece on September 20th, 2024.